friends. Hey, my name is Mike Falkenstein. I direct a ministry called 1-8 Catalyst here in South Metro Denver in the United States. And as always, I do this podcast with a good friend of mine, Steve Shermer of Silk Road Catalyst. He's based in South Carolina, and together we are the Missions Talk team. And it's so great to be able to do something like this with Steve. He's a good guy. Sure appreciate his heart for the lost, for missions, and he's a good guy to do this this show with. So this actually is part 2 of our interview with Jeff Ward, who is the Director of External Focus at Watermark Community Church. And External Focus is the Watermark Community Church way of just saying their missions program, right? Their missions team. And so they've kind of taken what we would call missions and done a little bit more with it, which in these episodes you kind of hear Jeff's heart and what he's doing. And so in this episode, we're going to talk with Jeff again a little bit more about international partnerships and working with people overseas versus kind of maybe the first thing that we ought to be able to be doing, that we should be doing, is looking in our cities where we live and see who God has brought us, right? So the very first place to do that a lot of times is you just go to your local university and you say, wow, there are people from 60 countries right here. And church, maybe, when it comes to strategic church missions, maybe that's the very first place to go. So thank you so much for joining us. If you want to learn more about Jeff, as he'll say at the end of this interview, you can go to watermark.org and get in touch with Jeff there. This is a good guy, and this is a great church. I really appreciate Watermark and all that they're doing. And so they are a church where we go, yeah, that actually would at least give us a template, if we're not doing anything in missions, to be able to kind of start from. So here's part 2 of our interview with Jeff Ward. That's great. And Jeff, that kind of leads me to our next topic we wanted to talk about in terms of in the kind of the bigger picture of churches thinking strategically about missions. So there's kind of I found over the years that this idea of they're already here, reach them when they're here, and so that they could go home, has been sort of a mixed bag. So it seems like I just remember, as you guys were talking about that, I remember back when I first got involved in ministry to China, when we were heavily involved in China, and there was kind of this idea at the time of sponsoring a Chinese pastor from China to come to a North American seminary, get him trained, and send him back. Right, that was kind of the pitch in terms of from a donor perspective. And what we found overwhelmingly is that once they were here, they ended up staying here and getting a job with a Chinese church in North America, and people were disappointed because it's like, no, that's not how that was supposed to go, right? That's not how that was supposed to go. Now, in the bigger picture, we can say, well, they are ministering to Chinese. It just happened to be now Chinese that are here in China. Mm-hmm. It does seem like, though, a lot of university students eventually do go back. And so in terms of, is it better for churches to take their own people and send them to, again, pick your country, or you've got people from that same country here who we can reach and then send back. And by the way, there's a lot of advantages there in terms of they already know the culture, they already know the language, right? There's a lot of this that's already kind of built in. So they don't have to spend 2 or 3 years doing language study. In terms of the kind of discerning how to do that, how you would encourage churches to kind of look at that, what kind of thoughts come to your mind as I bring up those questions?
Man, Mike, those are all great questions. Just the other day, I was over at our seminary here in one of our seminary here in Dallas. I sat at a table with a student from India who was getting his
Okay.
THM and
Okay.
was married. I got to talk to him about that. And he does intend to return, and he's got a church there that's sort of sponsoring him here. And so he wants to do that. He wants to be trained here and then go back in that context. So that is happening. And what you also said is true, which is, people also come with the intention and then they end up not going back. And so it's not really an either or. I think it's a both and. But, one of the challenges we have is, on the missions team or your missions committee at your church is we are allocating resources. And so, we have to do some level of diligence to understand, hey, what's effective, what is good, what is our biblical mandate again, but what is also effective. And so, again, a large part of our strategy is indigenous church planting organizations. And the reason is, I'll give you an example. We work with a terrific ministry partner in Southeast Asia. For about $1,800, they can identify, develop, train, equip, and launch a church planter in their context who does know the language, who does know the culture, and even in their country, because they know a language, they can actually reach into other unreached nations, across borders in ways that, again, a North American just would never be able to do, or it would take them 10 years of language training, to get to the point where they could do that. And then at some point they might get kicked out and repurposed, and resent somewhere else and more training. So as you think about sending North Americans or supporting, indigenous church planting organizations, for example, again, it's not an either or, but you go, man, for the price of a plane ticket to fly me over there, they can develop and train a church planter. And here's the kicker is the graduating church planter, and I've been to this location, they've planted about 35,000 churches.
Wow.
And their goal is 100,000 churches. And so they're well on their way. But it's interesting because the church planter who graduates from that program, their church planting kit is a Bible, a bongo, a bicycle, and a blanket. And that's about $250, but that's what they need in their context to plant a church. And then there's funding that goes with that for a period of time. And then on average, each one of those church planters plants 5 churches of their own. And so as a guy on staff who is figuring out, where do we allocate resources, it's really, you go, there might be more bang for the buck with the indigenous church planting organizations in terms of effectiveness than devoting a ton of resources to sending North Americans. But again, it's not an either or, it's a both and, but just how do you allocate resources? And that's a live conversation.
That's great. Well, 2 things quickly. One, of course, the bongo, right? That's necessary. I'm glad they've got that in the kit.
That's right.
You can't do it. No. But then also, Jeff, and Steve, I wanted to get your thoughts on this too. But one question for you, Jeff. So you're partnering with this indigenous agency. Are there some ways that you guys are going? Here's how we're holding you accountable to you indigenous people to how are you making sure that they're doing, what they're saying they're doing? Because that's important too, because Steve and I talk about this a lot, right? The guys in wherever, India, they want all the money, but there's no way to sometimes to tell what are you doing with it. So is there a good way you found to kind of hold those guys accountable?
You bet. It's kind of like Reagan, right? Trust but verify. Right. And so as you think about partnering, and I know you asked a question earlier about partnerships, and so as we think about partnerships, man, we look for, there's a few key things, especially in the global arena. Local side, we do this too. We do an annual partner assessment evaluation. It's a pretty robust process of, because organizations can drift. They can drift intentionally and make a choice to do something different, or they can drift unintentionally. And so again, it's stewarding resources. We look at alignment. mission, vision, philosophy. We look at trusted leadership, and that kind of plays into the answer to your question a little bit of, man, how it takes us a long time, really, honestly, to call somebody a partner. It means that we've spent time with their leadership team. Most of the time, we've had some boots on the ground to see their ministry model in action. We've talked to people. A lot of times it's calling another church. So when I meet with a new potential partner, I'll say, hey, can you connect me with one of your other church partners? I'd love to just understand from them what that experience has been like. Church-based is a big priority of ours. We want to do work less so than through necessarily an NGO or a individual, but more of church-based. And then mobilization. Are there opportunities to connect our body, that invitation piece, and it might be a short-term trip. It might be a small teaching team. It might be a medical team. It just depends on the kind of ministry that they're doing. But the more touch points that we can have with a ministry partner in their context, the more trust we'll have around the accountability piece.
Okay. So if you've partnered with this indigenous group, you're going to also have your own people there doing different things. And that does give you some kind of eyes on the project, so to speak, right?
For sure. Yeah. And then, usually there'll be an annual report. If we're funding a particular initiative or a project, we'll get status updates or, reports, on, if it's like, for example, we did a big water well initiative in Africa. And so we were getting, quarterly reports on drilling activities and even re-inspections of old wells for rehabbing purposes. And so, there is a level of, documentation and some of that comes with it.
That's great. Steve, I'm wondering, you and I have talked a lot about are we sending the Americans to Indonesia, or are we just training Indonesians to reach Indonesia? Where do your thoughts kind of go in terms of that dynamic?
My thoughts are in conflict with one another.
Oh,
it is
hard.
As Jeff keeps saying, it's both and. You can't, you as I've told you many times, Mike, sending out missionaries across culture from one country to the next, it probably should continue. We don't need to just nix the whole thing and act like, because there are places where I can find a national who isn't really effective in their ministry. Okay. But at the same time, long term, when we're looking at it from a long-term perspective, the nationals are the most critical piece of the puzzle. So you do need both, but there's kind of a conflicting, because Jeff said repurposing. Okay, missionaries go out. They constantly get repurposed. And I think the repurposing part of what he says, just from what I have observed over the years, and especially even more so in the last couple of years, that's increasing. I don't see that decreasing at all, especially in the more difficult places to get into. That is going to increase. And so we have to think about, who is the best person to get in. Now, maybe the best person isn't necessarily someone locally. Maybe initially it needs to be someone from, what we call a near national. They're technically would be considered in many cases an expat or a cross-cultural missionary, but they are at least close enough to that culture, maybe closer than we are. They have an easier time getting into those places. Just using countries off the top of my head, when you look at Nepal and India, it's easier for them to go back and forth between those countries than it is for us to get into those countries. Okay, it's not impossible for us to get into them, but it is easier for them to go back and forth and even stay longer than it is for us. And that's becoming more of a reality today than it was, let's say, 10, 20 years ago. And so we do need to be thinking about not stop sending. I think there's going to be churches, that's their passion, as Jeff has insinuated several times. It's their passion to send, in our case, Americans out, okay? Our church has a passion to do both. Our church sends Americans out. We also partner with certain nationals and specific places, but God's still calling us to go out. God's still calling the Chinese to go out of China.
Right.
I know. I just had a conversation with someone like that last night. He's calling Latin Americans out to go to the Middle East.
Oh,
We don't need to um, throw water on the fire in those places and turn it out in the name of just supporting nationals or just partnering with nationals. But at the same time, we have to be more serious about the national element of all this.
mm,
And like what I'm hearing from Jeff about Watermark is in some ways, at least one element, as he was mentioning, is very similar to what my church has done with nationals, is it's not a quick partnership. Okay. You just don't find something, get excited. Oh, let's just throw money at it. Here, I'm your ATM punching some numbers and you're just rolling out the dough to make sure because, you know, you are a cheaper guy than my American friend down the street who wants to go. My church took, I think, 5 years in walking alongside one of their national partners before they made it official, before they did anything. And so they were very meticulous. Well, that partnership has lasted over 20 years.
that's great.
Okay. And so it wasn't quick. It was methodical. They were careful, but they were prayerful, but they were also very intentional with it. And it has become an extremely fruitful partnership where now I think they've trained like a couple of thousand church planters in these 20 years, as a result. On the flip side, I'm not trying to criticize Americans who go, but, I can't say I've met too many Americans who can say they've trained that many people. Okay. When I've met nationals who have actually trained that many people. So,
Right.
When I say there's conflicting thoughts in what I say, it's constantly a battle for me. I don't mean to harp on this too much, but it's just a battle.
It's good. It is good. Jeff, I'm wondering if there are church leaders watching who, because Steve deals with this all the time. And Steve, you can speak to this if you want, but man, you get in some of these places around the world and you are really looked at as a ATM, right? And it's only for them primarily about the money. And they think these Americans are so wealthy and so, and for us, we want to help financially to reach your country for Christ. But if there are people who get into that mode of, boy, these partners now just see us as an ATM, how would you speak into that? Because it can become quite a drain in terms of, okay, now our only partnership with them is financial.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a little bit of that. If we're not careful and we're not careful with our theology and careful with our discipleship, it is really easy, and it happens on the local level. We can go into under-resourced or underserved areas of the community with a Messiah complex. A little bit of, hey, your community is in need. I've got what you need. If it's money, I've got money. If it's connections, I got connections. And man, there is that is death to the soul, honestly, because all of our resources are God-given. And right. You're like me, and you've been in some of the most under-resourced areas of the world. I was in a slum in Port-au-Prince, and there were 7 pastors from that area. They were meeting with several of us North Americans. We were down there with World Relief on that trip, and we were sitting across from each other. And the question posed to the Haitian pastors was, "What do you need?" And I was there, right? I had my pen, and I'm like, okay, they're going to say sanitation, clean water, and all of that. And they just looked at us and they go, "We don't need anything. We're praying for you."
Wow.
Like, we don't have anything, and so we depend on Jesus. We know we need him, and and his presence is all we need. You, on the other hand, with your materialism and your everything else, you're the ones that are in danger. And tears, conviction,
right.
And just going, no. Like, we're all broken. We're one beggar leading another to bread. We're not bringing Jesus to that context. He's there. And so, man, discipleship is a key part of that. And then just helping people, not be, come in with a business plan. And really, to lead with questions like, man, what do you love about your community? How is God moving and working? And like, let's focus on what he's doing. And then how do we just add fuel to that fire, rather than focusing on particularly the needs.
That's great. Well, yeah, that's good. Steve, I know as we begin to wrap up this episode, you had another question for Jeff. Do you want to get into that, or should we get into our final question we had? What do you want to do?
No, we'll get to the final question. I do want to piggyback off
Please.
what Jeff said. I hear stories like that, and when I meet people like that, like the guy the pastors you're talking about in Haiti, those are people you just want to work with.
Yeah, really.
I mean, because you can see that they get it. Because I was at a meeting somewhere. I can't remember where I was at, but this guy was talking about. He was in North Africa. He was involved in business. He was going to walk in. He was going to throw a lot of money. I'm talking a lot of money into a project. So he hired a local Christian cab driver to drive him around. And in the end, he said, okay, I'm going to let you decide what we do with our money. And he rattled off the figure. And he gave him 3 projects. Says, the people here, you choose. And the guy said, keep your money. He says, if you want to do something for us, then teach us how to make money. Teach us how to do business, because your money may solve the problem temporarily, but if you teach us how to make money, we'll solve the problems long term. And we'll be able to fix all this stuff. And so, it's hard when I'm sure when you walk. I've never been to Haiti, but I've been to slums in India, Nepal, been to some challenging places in China. And other places, when you're around that, especially as a North American or European, it is hard to be around that and not want to do something. I know from our perspective, we're not necessarily being wrong and wanting to do something. It's a matter of hitting the brakes and say, hold on, is what I'm doing, as Jeff mentioned in the book, When Helping Hurts, am what I'm doing actually helping, or is it hurting? Because the methodical approach that Watermark takes, my church takes, in building partnerships with people, you got to learn. You're going to learn over that period of time if what you do is actually going to help, and what can you do that's going to help, versus what your knee-jerk reaction is when you first see it. Because our knee-jerk reaction is what causes the problems. It is what creates extremely unhealthy dependency. It doesn't create partnerships. And so, so I love that story. I'm glad you shared it. I'm going to keep it in my arsenal.
Steve,
when I talk to people.
That's a great word. And if I could just to piggyback on that for church leaders, another great book in addition to When Helping Hurts, and we use all of their stuff, is Toxic Charity by Bob Lupton. And so, Bob does ministry in South Atlanta, and, tells the story of well-meaning, well-intentioned churches who come in with resources, right? It might be, I affectionately call it, turkey dinners and Christmas, baskets. And he says, charity can be the kindest way to destroy someone. Because if you're doing for people what they can and are able to do for themselves, then you're actually destroying that dignity, that value, that worth, that imago Dei, in the folks that we're trying to serve. Not to mention the Messiah complex in the person who's doing the serving, right? And so, man, if we can find ways to really empower people to be all that God intended them to be, and so many of the guys that I work with, even locally, that are maybe formerly incarcerated, or they've come to faith, they've turned the corner in their life, but they've got barriers to employment. And they're like, man, I don't need another food pantry. I don't want free clothes and free food. Like, I'm a contributor. I'm a producer. I've got a strong work ethic. I know how to make a lot of money fast on the streets. And I know that's not who I am anymore as a new creation in Christ. Can you help me with a job? So I think the more that we can as the church, relief is always necessary. It's necessary for those catastrophic situations in lives or disasters. But I think sometimes we apply, relief aid to situations that are more chronic in nature, that have been going on a long time, and they need more of a development solution. How can we just remove barriers to allow people to provide for themselves in the context of discipleship? Because if all you're doing is increasing somebody's income so they can spend it on things that are going to be destructive in their life, then you're not helping them. So it's got to be in the context of discipleship.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. Well, good. So, Jeff, as we end this episode, I'm wondering if you'd have some kind of final words for, if there are some church leaders out there that are going, wow, this has been great. It feels like, drinking out of a fire hose kind of a thing. If there's some kind of first steps, hey, we just want to define, we just want to begin. Because I think there are a lot of churches out there that are going, we know we're supposed to be doing something in relation to Great Commission fulfillment in terms of missions. If there's kind of a first kind of steps for churches to begin to kind of define, kind of an overall goal of a church missions program, what will work for us, what God's doing. Maybe for both of you, Jeff, we'll start with you. What would kind of be some first steps that they could take that you'd recommend?
That's a great question. And so, man, what I would hate is for viewers to go, oh man, Watermark's got this all figured out, because we don't. If you had another hour and a half, I'd tell you about most everything we've learned by making mistakes. And and here's the thing that I think gives me some peace. You mentioned John 14. I always think of John 14:27. It's like peace, because we just got to give ourselves a lot of grace in this process, because we're going to make missteps. We do it all the time locally, with friends in areas of the city we're trying to serve, and our hearts are in the right place, but with missteps. And so God is going to accomplish his purposes. And so he is sovereign. And so he'll accomplish those purposes really despite us, in many cases, and not because of us. And so, our scorecard is just faithfulness. And so, the parable of the talents is awesome, because, the guys who were given something of great value to invest, they weren't responsible for the outcome. He didn't say, well done, good and savvy. Well done, good and strategic servant. He said, well done, good and faithful servant. And, the outcomes, he left, he's responsible for. So I think, being thoughtful and just knowing we're all on this journey together, talking with other churches, learning, and, just starting, we often say around here, because it can feel a little bit like you're stepping into the cockpit of a 747 when you start talking about global missions.
Right.
And it's like, where do we start? And, we're like, hey, you know what? Just simply start simply, take one person who's passionate around missions, who's got a heart for it, and go on a journey together and see where the Lord leads. And, or start one relationship, as Steve mentioned, with that might take some time. Also, remember, it's a long play, right? I mean, nothing is microwaved. And, if you look at the history of missions and some of the missionary biographies, decades and decades of faithfulness, and they may or may not see fruit on this side of heaven. And so just, again, being faithful.
That's right. I've been think of that in relation to that, Jeff, the story of William Carey is probably my favorite, right? Goes to India, 7 years. Yeah. He sees no one come to Christ. And I'm sure it's like, man, you're 6 years in and you're going, okay, Lord, what are you doing here? So, but then of course we know the rest of the story. Really, God really used him, but that 7 years. So Steve, I'm wondering kind of whatever final thoughts you have, any other, hey, if there's church leaders there that are wanting to figure this out, what would your kind of last takes be, or your final takes be for them?
I would emphasize what Jeff said. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. I often run to people who get passionate about the unreached and getting the gospel to them, and they're just such in a hurry. And they act like, well, if I don't get there today, it's, I'm being disobedient. Two, something's going to just blow up in my face. It's like, just stop, just be methodical, think through it. I know, like Jeff's church, our church doesn't have it all together. No church ever does. But there is intentionality in place. when I listen to Jeff, what I appreciate about Watermark and what I appreciate about my home church is just the intentionality behind the missions effort, and both locally and globally, how they develop partnerships, how they support their partnerships. And I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about how they try to care for the people, how they're trying to get the people in the pews engaged locally and globally. So while no one needs to think anyone has it all together, I do want to emphasize that there is clear intentionality behind it. And being intentional is critical, because if we're not going to just we can't just speak it. I mean, we can talk about our vision all day long. We can talk about our desires all day long, but those talking about our vision, writing down goals, doesn't actually produce anything. All it does is produce a desire, and it produces written down goals that you can show people on paper.
Oh, right.
But it doesn't actually do anything.
Right.
You have to put some effort behind it. You have to be intentional behind it. And you have to start somewhere. Start with one thing. Don't rush into it, but start one place, build it, develop it, and then see how God will take that to the next level, as well as lead you into other areas. Like our church is in, like Watermark. There are multiple countries, multiple things locally. Just start. We were talking about before the video. We were talking about the Think Media team. Not to give them a promo or anything, but one of the things they always say when talking about people getting on YouTube is just hit record, which is basically don't worry about all the making it perfect today. Just start.
Right.
And so in missions, it's not as easy as just saying hit record, but God's given you gifts, God's given you talents, God's put people in your church. Just start where you're at. But be intentional about praying about how God's going to develop it over time. Just like it does in our church, just like Jeff has mentioned in their church, how it's developed over the years. Because God will get you to a much bigger place later, but just start somewhere today.
That's great. I love that. So Jeff, we're so thankful that you joined us. Great conversation. Obviously, we could go another hour or more probably. And so thank you so much. I'm wondering, Jeff, if there's some people who want to get in touch with you, who say, hey, if you'd be willing just to take a few minutes to have a further conversation, what are the best ways for people to get in touch with you and find out about what you guys are doing in the external focus team at Watermark?
I would love that, Mike. And so obviously just email is always great, jward@watermark.org, and then happy to follow up with resources. We talk about sending, we've got a little bit of a sending track, which is kind of a program, a paradigm that we think about. Any of our resources, I'd be happy to send to anybody, and they can contextualize and use any of it. We also have a church leaders conference that is typically in the spring, April, May timeframe, which we invite people to do. We do breakouts around all of these topics. And so people can participate in that. And then, we have I'd love the conversation.
That's great. And I would encourage people watching to get in touch with Jeff, not only around kind of missions, but I know only a little about this church leaders conference, and man, in terms of kind of thinking strategically about all areas around church, I think, Jeff, you guys are doing a good job there. And so then you've said, hey, maybe we've got some things that, we could teach others, is great. So I appreciate that. And I would just encourage people to do that. So great. Well, thanks again, Jeff. Thanks for your time. Steve, as always, great to be with you. And we'll look forward to seeing you all who are watching on the next episode of Missions Talk.